The most unkillable soldier in history, Adrian Carton de Wiart, the one-eyed warrior who survived 11 bullets and 2 world wars. There are men whose lives sound like fiction. Legends embroidered in medals and scars, stories whispered in regimental bars where whiskey softens memory and men speak louder to hide fear. But sometimes reality refuses to sound reasonable. Sometimes a person appears who seems carved out of iron and stubbornness, someone who treats bullets like inconveniences and war like a sport. Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart was that man. To read his record is to lose track of how many times he was shot, blown up, or otherwise maimed, only to shrug and march again. To imagine him is to picture a figure from a bygone age. Tall, severe, mustached like a cavalry officer from storybooks. Black eye patch pressed over an empty socket like a pirate who misplaced his ship and joined the British Army instead. But he was no caricature. He was flesh, bone, and an almost supernatural refusal to die. And his story begins, fittingly, with a lie. Adrian was born in Brussels in 1880 to a wealthy Catholic family. His father, a Belgian aristocrat and financier, expected him to become a gentleman, refined, educated, polished like marble in the salons of Europe. Instead, young Adrian preferred danger. He climbed walls, wrestled bigger boys, and sought physical tests with a wild gleam in his eye. His tutors called him uncontrollable. His father called him spirited. Adrian, if he had words for it then, might have simply said he was bored. England offered discipline and structure, or so his father hoped. Adrian was sent to boarding school, where the rigid rules only sharpened his appetite for rebellion. He boxed. He fought. He ran faster, climbed higher, punched harder than any polite child was supposed to. But fire finds fuel. And in 1899, at 19, the spark caught flame. The Boer War was breaking out in South Africa. Britain called for volunteers. Adrian did not ask permission. He forged paperwork, claimed to be British, claimed to be older, and enlisted in the British Army under a false name. That was the first attempt fate made to stop him. It would not be the last. The transport ship creaked across the sea, packed with ambitious young men eager for glory. Boys really, most dreaming of adventure. Adrian, by contrast, stared ahead like a hound scenting battle. When he first set eyes on African soil, his heart beat not with dread but recognition. This was what he was made for. The war introduced him to hardship and horror in the same breath, but he embraced both. When bullets snapped through the air, he advanced. When artillery shook the earth, he held his ground. Officers noticed his courage almost immediately. So did bullets. He was shot in the stomach and groin. For most men, such wounds would mean terror, agony, and prayers. For Adrian, they were simply proof that he was where he belonged. He survived. He always seemed to survive. Doctors patched him up. He demanded to return to the front. They shook their heads. He stared them down. Eventually, the army relented, and back he went like a wolf returning to the hunt with scars for trophies. By the time the war ended, the British Army knew his name, his real one. And they did not punish him for lying. They rewarded him. A new legend had begun. Through early postings in India and Somaliland, Adrian learned 3 things deeply. War built him more than peace ever could. Pain was temporary. And death, for reasons unknown, refused to take him. In Somaliland, hunting rebel leader Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, the Mad Mullah, as the British called him, Adrian found himself in brutal desert fighting against fierce guerrilla forces. It was there that his legend hardened. Charging through rifle fire at the head of men, his face contorted in battle fury, he was shot again. This time the bullet lodged near his eye. He spat blood, wiped the wound, and kept going. His men followed because there was no world in which they could keep up with him otherwise. When the campaign ended, he was wounded, again, but promoted and decorated. It would not be the last time people awarded him for sheer refusal to die. By now, comrades spoke his name with a mixture of awe and incredulity. Officers admired him. Surgeons dreaded him. He never complained, rarely rested, and walked like a man convinced destiny wore a uniform. But destiny had larger plans. Europe was tumbling toward the First World War. And Adrian, now an officer of the British Army proper, marched toward the greatest storm the world had ever known. The trenches of the Western Front were a hell where hope withered. Mud sucked at boots, rats gnawed flesh, artillery never slept, and men died in screaming clouds of gas and steel. It was a graveyard stretched across continents. Adrian walked into it with the calm of a man entering familiar territory. As battalion commander, he led from the front, not as a figurehead, but as a warrior who believed rank meant responsibility to go first. His officers begged him to stay back. His men pleaded. Adrian simply tightened his belt, adjusted his revolver, and climbed the ladder into gunfire. He charged machine guns with wounded hands, rallied broken companies, and survived explosions that tore others apart. When his left eye was shot out, he wrapped a bandage around his head and returned to the line. When part of his left hand was shattered by shrapnel, he tried to continue fighting. Infection set in. Surgeons told him the fingers needed amputation. He grew impatient. Legend says Adrian tore the bandages off with his teeth and removed 2 remaining fingers himself because the doctors were too slow. Whether literal or exaggerated, everyone believed it, because by then, anything sounded possible for him. When finally forced from the line to recover, the War Office tried to keep him safe. He escaped the hospital and returned. They reassigned him. He found his way back again. He earned the Victoria Cross, the highest award for military valor, not in a single act, but in a relentless campaign of courage few could comprehend. By the end of the war, he had been wounded multiple times, lost an eye and a hand, and yet stood straighter than many unscarred officers. He rejoined civilian society out of duty, but peace felt wrong to him. Silence, after so much steel, seemed unnatural. War was not his addiction. It was his nature. The interwar years were strange for Adrian. He married a gentlewoman named Countess Friederike Maria Carolini and fathered children. He attempted to settle into diplomatic roles, assignments in places like Poland and the Baltics, where his stern presence demanded respect from volatile governments and fragile alliances. But a hawk cannot pretend to be a songbird. Beneath the tailored suits and polite dinners, he remained a soldier. He practiced pistol aim with his good hand and shot clay pigeons with astonishing precision. He rode with the same reckless confidence as in his youth. Servants whispered that their master could stare holes through walls. Europe's peace was fragile, and Adrian felt it. The world was inhaling before a scream, and he knew the sound all too well. When the storm returned in 1939, he was ready before most younger men even understood the stakes. He was 60 when the Second World War began, old by military standards, but his will was unbroken. Britain needed experience, and Adrian offered his without hesitation. He served again in Poland, coordinating British efforts and preparing defenses as Nazi power expanded like a dark tide swallowing borders. Then came tragedy disguised as fate's next test. In 1941, while flying to Yugoslavia on a diplomatic mission, his plane malfunctioned and crashed into the sea off the Libyan coast. Many men would die from the impact alone. Adrian surfaced, coughing salt water, helping pull survivors to land, all with one functional hand and one eye. Exhausted, soaked, and battered, he staggered ashore, only to be captured by Italian forces. For a man who had defied bullets, bombs, and disease, prison was an insult. A cage was more offensive to him than enemy fire. He would not tolerate confinement. The Italian camp that held him was not designed for a prisoner like Adrian. Guards underestimated him. They saw an old officer with a missing eye and hand, not a living storm wrapped in skin. Within weeks, he was planning escape. His captors discussed releasing him on humanitarian grounds, impressed by his rank and injuries. He rejected the offer. He would not accept charity from the enemy. So he dug tunnels. He studied patrol routes. He gathered supplies. He moved at night like a ghost who limped but never slowed. When at last he and fellow officers broke free, the countryside swallowed them in darkness. They moved across hills and fields, sleeping in barns and hiding by day, enduring hunger, thirst, and the constant scent of pursuit. Adrian walked until his body trembled, then kept walking because he had never known surrender. Freedom came not through dramatic rescue, but through diplomacy. After months loose in enemy territory, he reached safe channels and was returned to British command. He had escaped a prison camp at 61 with one hand, one eye, and unbreakable will. And incredibly, he asked to return to combat. When Adrian Carton de Wiart returned to British hands in 1943, no one quite knew what to do with him. A man over 60, missing an eye and a hand, scarred by decades of war, newly escaped from a prison camp. Most would have been offered retirement, a cushioned chair in a quiet office, a ceremonial farewell. But Adrian did not know softness, and softness did not know him. He arrived in Cairo from neutral Portugal, stepping off the aircraft in a worn uniform, gaunt from months of hiding and evading enemy patrols, yet standing straight as a bayonet. Officers who had only heard legend now saw the reality. A lean, hawk-faced warrior with an eye patch, a stiff military posture, and a presence that felt like steel forged into human shape. Rumors traveled faster than aircraft. Soldiers whispered in mess tents. Pilots murmured in briefing rooms. Sailors grinned in port bars. Carton de Wiart's back. The old pirate escaped the Italians. Death still can't catch him. When he was summoned to headquarters, a young staff captain stared in awe, unsure whether to salute or cross himself. Adrian nodded curtly, not rude, simply uninterested in ceremony, and waited for orders that never came. Britain respected him tremendously, but they also feared what he had become. Not broken, but sharpened into something so uncompromising that ordinary military life could not contain him. He was too valuable and too dangerous to waste. So they sent him far from the bullets he craved to a theater where diplomacy carried more weight than gunpowder. He was assigned to China. To Adrian, China in 1943 felt like entering a world suspended between ancient dynasties and modern catastrophe. Nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek wrestled with Japanese invasion, communist insurgency, and internal instability. American envoys hovered, Soviet influence lurked, and chaos simmered like water about to boil over. Into this boiling pot strode a one-eyed, one-handed British general with scars older than most officers and mannerisms from a past era. He was appointed as Winston Churchill's personal representative to Chiang Kai-shek. Diplomacy did not suit him. The endless dinners, formal greetings, and political games grated against his instincts. But professional duty mattered. Britain needed someone unshakable, someone who commanded respect by mere presence. And on that battlefield, Adrian was still lethal. When he entered a room, Chinese officials studied him like a mythical relic. An old warlord once whispered to an aide, "This is what the Europeans looked like when they conquered the world." Adrian spoke plainly. He despised bureaucracy, scorned shirkers, ignored flattery, and treated generals the way he treated soldiers, with blunt expectation. Those who mistook his injuries for weakness quickly understood reality. Not only was he mentally sharper than most around him, he could still ride, shoot, and endure hardship with frightening ease. There were moments, rare but telling, when even hardened Chinese commanders looked uneasy in his presence, not because he threatened them, but because he reminded them of a breed nearly extinct. A man who did not fear death because he had met it many times and refused its invitation. War in China was not trench warfare, nor cavalry charges, nor hand-to-hand fury. It was waiting, negotiating, maneuvering through invisible front lines of influence and mistrust. For the first time in his life, Adrian fought a war without a rifle in his hand. He read intelligence reports, advised Chiang, mediated tensions between allied missions. He traveled over rough roads and into precarious provinces, sometimes under threat from Japanese bombers or bandits, yet always maintaining the same calm, unshakable demeanor. Some nights, he stared at the mountains and longed for the simple clarity of charging across open fields toward gunfire. Politics was muddy, diplomacy exhausting. Combat had been brutal but honest. This, by contrast, required patience, intellect, and restraint. And he excelled. In a world crumbling under ideological and military chaos, he was a pillar. Not flexible, not accommodating, but immovable. His very existence steadied negotiations. Generals who distrusted slick diplomats trusted him because he spoke truth without varnish. He neither schemed nor bowed. He was, before anything else, a soldier. China brought moments of reflection. He had outlived wars, comrades, even empires. The world around him was changing quickly. Tanks replacing horses, aircraft replacing infantry charges, ideology replacing honor. Sometimes at dinner parties, as champagne flowed and political guests laughed, Adrian would silently rub the empty sleeve pinned to his tunic, feeling a phantom ache. His missing eye sometimes pulsed in memory. He would excuse himself, step outside, and breathe night air heavy with incense and distant gunfire. He was not sentimental, but he was human. He had known men who died in his arms. He had buried friends in mud, frost, and sand. He had watched courage and cowardice, nobility and bloodlust, discipline and madness. War had been his truest companion, and now peace, even fragile, temporary peace, felt like an unfamiliar stranger. There were moments when he wondered, quietly, who am I when not at war? It was a question with no answer, because fate refused to give him peace long enough to solve it. When World War II ended, Adrian returned to England. He had served the crown for nearly half a century. He had bled in deserts, jungles, trenches, mountains, and seas. He had commanded armies, survived prisons, and shaped international alliances. Finally, someone in London decided the indestructible general had earned rest. He retired in 1947, moving to a quiet estate in County Cork, Ireland. The house overlooked green fields and calm riverbanks, a landscape so peaceful it almost mocked his history. For the first time in his life, he slowed. He walked slower, not from weakness, but from leisure. He sat by the fire. He read books about medieval campaigns. He enjoyed the company of friends and the loyalty of his dogs. He loved dogs more than most people, once writing with perfect sincerity. A dog is the only true friend a man can have. But even in peace, his fire never fully dimmed. Once, when a group of schoolboys visited the estate and one asked how he lost his eye, Adrian smiled almost mischievously and replied, "Bitten by a lion." The children gasped. He chuckled softly. Imagination was a kind of battle, too. His neighbors spoke of him with awe and affection. When he walked through town, posture straight, mustache immaculate, black eye patch in place, even into his 80s, people stood taller, as if a gust of history had swept past. He remained elegant, dignified, and iron-willed. Yet age, the one enemy he could not outshoot or outrun, crept quietly. Bones stiffened. Scars ached in damp weather. His left sleeve hung empty, his right hand curled slightly, his step sometimes faltered. He did not fight this battle. He accepted it, not because he feared death, but because he had spent a lifetime defying it, and now, at last, he felt ready. On June 5th, 1963, Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart died in his sleep, at the age of 83. No bullet took him, no explosion claimed him, no battlefield drowned him in mud or fire. The man who had walked through wars like a myth, who had laughed in the face of death so many times it became routine, simply closed his eye and rested. It felt almost unfair that such a life should end quietly, but in truth, it was perfect. A warrior who had lived without fear deserved to depart without violence. There was no dramatic last speech, no grand farewell, just the silent passing of a man who had outlasted eras. He left behind a world fundamentally different from the one he entered, mechanized, political, anxious, modern. And yet, whenever stories of impossible courage are told, his name surfaces like a relic from a time when men believed valor could defy mortality. Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart was not merely hard to kill. He was impossible to break. To speak of Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart is to tell the truth about a kind of man who barely exists anymore, perhaps never existed outside a handful of names etched in fading regimental plaques, and in the whispered boasting of old soldiers in quiet pubs. He was not reckless. Recklessness is panic disguised as courage. He was not fearless. Only fools lack fear. He was something rarer. A man who understood mortality so profoundly that he refused to treat it as a cage. What makes someone like Adrian? How does a boy from aristocratic Europe become a living legend carved from scars and stubbornness? Some say genetics. Some say fate. Some say madness disguised as discipline. He had privileges, yes. Education, status, opportunity. But privilege does not teach a man to stand in rifle fire without flinching. Comfort does not prepare a man to crawl through desert sand with wounds burning like coal. His strength came from conviction, a simple, brutal worldview honed in the age of empires and tested in the age of machines. Life is duty. Duty is service. Service demands sacrifice. To him, pain was ordinary, and fear was irrelevant. He believed a soldier must go first. He believed death was honorable, and therefore not frightening. He believed action mattered more than theory, and discipline more than comfort. This mindset would be foreign, even alarming, in our world of safeguards and therapy and self-preservation. To modern eyes, his values seem harsh, almost ruthless. But to men who followed him, to young soldiers trembling before their first charge, to wounded men gasping in trenches, to faces pale with mud and terror, he was not harsh. He was hope. If he could walk through hell with an eye missing and a hand gone and still command with calm certainty, then what excuse did they have to falter? He demanded courage, and he created courage in those around him. Veterans who served with him told stories long after the wars ended. Some were almost unbelievable. But when the subject is a man who seemed immortal, disbelief becomes surrender. A young officer once described him walking calmly across a battlefield under machine gun fire, coat buttoned, cane in hand like a gentleman strolling his garden. When asked later if he felt fear, Adrian shrugged. It was only the usual fuss. On another occasion, when shrapnel tore his face open and blinded him temporarily, he insisted on being bandaged at the front line, snapping, "I won't be carted away like a parcel." When a comrade complained about trench conditions, the rats, the mud, the stench, Adrian simply said, "You are alive, aren't you? Splendid. Act like it." He refused to carry umbrellas, calling them a ridiculous affectation. He refused evacuation until physically dragged. He refused weakness in himself first, and therefore in others. There is a story, told quietly and likely embroidered by time, that once he spotted a sniper flash, raised his pistol with his one good hand, and dropped the shooter with a single shot. Asked how he saw the glint with one eye, he replied, "I don't need two eyes to know where cowards hide." Whether true or exaggerated hardly matters. His reputation made such tales believable. Soldiers in wartime create myths to fill the void where certainty should be. They invent symbols of strength to armor themselves against terror. Adrian did not need invention. He was that symbol. To young troops seeing him gallop past on horseback, despite age and wounds, he seemed supernatural. To prisoners who heard he escaped captivity at 61, he seemed unstoppable. To diplomats in China watching him ride mountainside roads while younger men clung to jeeps, he seemed carved from a different geological layer of humanity. Even enemies respected him. A captured Italian general once told a British officer, "There are many brave men in your army, but only one devil." The British officer did not need to ask who he meant. Peace is sometimes a harsher judge than battle. It reveals who a man is when stripped of purpose. Some warriors fade without war. Some break. Others become restless, haunted. Adrian did none of these. He adjusted with surprising grace, not because he lost his hunger for battle, but because discipline guided him even in quiet years. When victory came, he accepted retirement not as a retreat but as a final duty. He took long walks along Irish fields, the air cool and sweet, carrying no rifle, wearing no medals. He tended to his garden. He drank whiskey by the fireplace. He hosted guests who expected a monster and found a gentleman, blunt, yes, but warm in his own austere way. And always, dogs. He adored them, trusted them more than humans. Dogs did not pretend. Dogs were loyal without speeches, brave without glory, fierce without cruelty. If there was softness in him, it appeared in those moments, scratching behind a terrier's ears while the same hand once gripped a pistol in mud filled with dying men. He did not write memoirs out of ego. He wrote them because friends insisted the world must know the truth. Even then, the book, Happy Odyssey, contains no dramatic self-praise, no moral grandstanding, no apologies. He recounts being shot like one recounts spilled tea, a nuisance. He speaks of losing his hand as if misplacing a tool. He describes combat as an enthusiast describes sport, intense, exhausting, invigorating. He did not glorify war, but he respected it as a crucible where character is proven or destroyed. He believed men were meant to stand for something greater than themselves. Whether one agrees or not, the consistency of his belief is undeniable. He lived what he preached. He bled for what he swore to serve. He never asked of others what he would not do first. That is leadership stripped of vanity. There is a final image worth holding. An Irish dusk. Soft evening mist rising from the riverbanks. A black Labrador at his heel. An old general, posture erect even at 83, standing at the edge of his land, looking over quiet fields. He lifts his chin slightly, as if smelling distant powder, though there is none. One sleeve pinned neatly where an arm once was. An eye patch dark against white hair. A silhouette that could be mistaken for a statue of some forgotten knight. But he is not forgotten. He simply does not need anyone to remember. Memory is a luxury, not a mission. He turns, pats the dog's head, walks back toward the house. Inside, the fireplace glows. Outside, the world changes without him. And somewhere, soldiers tell stories of a man who did not die because death respected him too much to insist. That night, he sleeps. And this time, he does not wake to the sound of guns or duty calling. The warrior finally rests. Today, his name lives quietly in military history books, in museums, in dusty regimental archives. But among soldiers, especially those who study grit, discipline, and raw will, his legend burns. He is proof that the body breaks, but spirit can refuse. Courage is not lack of fear, but domination of it. Duty, when chosen freely, can forge indestructibility. Some lives, by sheer force of character, transcend mortality. In an age obsessed with safety and comfort, his life feels impossible, a reminder that humanity's limits are farther, stranger, and fiercer than we remember. He was not just impossible to kill. He was impossible to stop. And that, more than medals or myths, is the mark of a life lived at full burn. When historians rank warriors, many are more famous. Some won larger battles. Some commanded grander theaters. But courage is not measured in size, only in depth. And if courage were a mountain, Adrian Carton de Wiart would still be standing at the summit, coat buttoned, mustache straight, daring the world to climb beside him. The man who would not die did more than survive. He proved how unbreakable the human will can be.